The Magi bring gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold, that makes sense. Frankincense, yeah, not so much. That's not a gift we would think of giving. But that particular gift was laced in significance. And in this episode, we're going to unpack that and why it made Herod deeply disturbed. A few months ago, I was leading a biblical study trip to Turkey, and we were flying as a group from Istanbul to the southern part of the country, beautiful place called Antalya. And I happened to be sitting next to somebody that wasn't someone in our group. And so I'm sitting there and I'm pretty introverted outside of, communication and all of that. And so I don't say a whole lot. The person next to me was an extrovert, like on steroids, and he was just chat, but I actually was really enjoying it. And I found out pretty quickly in our conversation that he was a DJ, and not just any DJ. He was ranked as one of the top DJs in the world. And so I started asking him a lot of questions because I've never sat next to a world-class DJ before. And in the midst of our conversation, he made mention of the fact that he was anticipating becoming the first person to live stream a concert from space. And I mean, it was like, is this like a pipe dream or is this something that's in the works? He goes, no, this is actually in the works. We're hoping to pull this thing off in the next 6 months or so. He said, I will actually be 55,000 feet up in the air, mixing music and live streaming it from space. And so, I had a lot more questions that I wanted to ask, but the plane landed and he was sitting in the aisle seat. And as soon as the plane came to a complete stop, he stood up, he opened up the overhead compartment, and he pulled out something and he said, hey man, I think this will fit you perfectly. And he tossed me this jacket. Yes, one of the coolest things I have ever seen. And he went on to explain that this was their team jacket. And everyone on his team had this jacket, and it was all around this expedition to be the first person to do a concert from space. He told me it was going to fit me perfectly, and the moment I donned it, I was like, this thing fits perfectly, and it's unbelievable. Now, what makes this jacket so meaningful is the fact that, one, it is rare. Almost nobody else has this particular jacket. But what makes it even more meaningful to me is that this jacket was from this guy's story. There was something that he was building, and this is a reflection of something that was meaningful to him, and he shared that meaning by passing it on to me. And as we jump into this part of the gift giving of the Magi, we're tapping into a very similar idea. That when the Magi show up, as we talked in the first episode, gold is something that you would expect to give to someone you believed to be a king. But it were these other items, the frankincense and myrrh, that are a little bit like, I'm not sure I saw that one coming. And as we talk specifically about frankincense, we're tapping into what is likely something that came from the place of origin of the Magi. It wasn't just a gift that was rare or expensive, but it also had meaning because it likely came from where the Magi hailed from. Now, as we talked in part 1, this is one of 2 options for where the Magi came from. The first option we had talked about before was off in the region of Parthia. The second option is in the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula from modern-day Yemen. And in that talk, when we were talking about those options, we mentioned that when it came to the gold, that world supply in the ancient world was from a place called Nubia, which was in the northern part of modern-day Sudan. But as we mentioned, when it came to the frankincense and myrrh, we're dealing with the Horn of Africa, and as it relates to the Arabian Peninsula, we're talking about Yemen. This is where you find frankincense. And the way that you get frankincense is harvesting the resin from the Boswellia sacra tree. And basically what you do is this: you take a knife and you cut into the tree and the raw resin seeps through. You wait for it to harden, and then you literally just take a knife and scrape it off the tree. And in doing so, you have frankincense. And this is something that was obviously very sweet smelling when you burned it. It was used in incense. It was also used for perfumes. Now, additionally, and most notably, in the Hebrew Scriptures in the Old Testament, frankincense was used for worship. So when you open up the book of Leviticus, you find the grain offering, and in the grain offering, you find that you are mixing olive oil with the grain with frankincense, and that's the offering that you give. But where it really shows up is in the concoction or the mixture for the incense that is used on what we call the altar of incense, which was in the tabernacle and then later in the temple. Now, we read about this in Exodus 30 because God is giving instructions to Moses about what the mixture should entail, and within the ingredients we have pure frankincense. And so God will then also go on a couple verses later and say, this is my mixture. If anybody else tries to replicate this for a use other than my own in the temple, he said they must be cut off from Israel. And so you see that it has a very important usage for worship in the Scriptures, which connects to our story, because when the Magi show up, they're not just showing up to offer these gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They are showing up to worship, and they are coming to worship the King. As we read in Matthew chapter 2, they're showing up asking about where the King is, and they are going to have gifts for this particular king. Now, this is not something that the Magi were probably thinking about when they were journeying all the way to the land of Israel to offer these gifts to baby Jesus. But as someone who is listening to the story in Matthew, as we are listening to the details of the storyline, we are meant to connect back to some other stories and passages in the Old Testament that echo what's going on with the Magi. Chief among those is the story about the Queen of Sheba coming to Solomon. Now, this is happening approximately 1,000 years before the time of Jesus, and this queen comes to offer gifts to Solomon. Now, she is known as the Queen of Sheba, and Sheba has traditionally been associated with present-day Yemen. So in the ancient world, this was the region of Sheba. Now, notice this passage from 1 Kings 10 about her visit, and just notice all the parallels that we have with the story of the coming of the Magi. So 1 Kings 10:2, arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan, with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold and precious stones, she came to Solomon and talked with him about all she had on her mind. I mean, we've got so many parallel details here. Now, let's take it one step further, because Solomon is a son of David. Now, that is significant, because when you start talking about a son of David, you are starting to tap into the storyline about how God promised David that a descendant of his would be the one that would start or initiate an everlasting kingdom. And so this phrase, Son of David, became a very important title around the coming Messiah and King that God would work through in order to launch His everlasting kingdom. Now, when Matthew starts his gospel, notice how he begins the very first verse. This is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. One of the things that Matthew wants to show in his gospel is how Jesus is a son of David. Now again, you say son of David and you're tapping into the promises God made to David about his descendants and the forthcoming kingdom. And passages that you can look up on your own to go deeper with this. 2 Samuel 7, 11 to 16. This is where God makes this promise to David. You have Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 to 7, a very traditional passage that is read during the Christmas season because it talks about, to us a child is given, to us a son is born, the government is going to be on his shoulders. It's a passage you probably know well. Another passage you may not know as well comes from Daniel 2:44, where God makes this promise about how after all of these kingdoms have their shot on the scene, God's everlasting kingdom is going to begin, and it coincides with the coming of Jesus and the Romans ruling the world. And so as an informed kind of reader of the biblical story, we're already seeing that the Magi's coming is connected to all of these other stories that point to a coming king. And two more passages that are very critical to the biblical narrative come from Isaiah chapter 60 and Psalm 72. And notice this first one, Isaiah 60, verses 3 and 6. The writer writes, "Nations will come to your light," and this is talking about the coming king, "and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Herds of camels will cover your land, young camels of Midian and Ephah, and all from Sheba will come bearing gold and incense and proclaiming the praise of the Lord." So we have this connection of Sheba again, which correlates to present-day Yemen, bringing gold and incense. That should sound very familiar. And so there is an echo going on here. We have also an echo happening in Psalm 72, which is a psalm about a king, or about the king of Israel. And this one says, "May the desert tribes bow before him and his enemies lick the dust. May the kings of Tarshish and of distant shores bring tribute to him. May the kings of Sheba," another reference to Sheba, "and Seba present him gifts. And may all kings bow down to him and all nations serve him." And so you have the giving of gifts here as well. And I really like what Dr. James Martin does to very succinctly summarize these two passages in particular. He just says, Isaiah 60 and Psalm 72 look forward to a day when the leaders of the Gentiles or nations would come and bow and pay tribute to the King of Israel as their king. And we see that with the coming of the Magi, because the very language that we have is that on the coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary. And what do? They bowed down and they worshiped him. And this was such a risky act. Like, I think we often don't appreciate the behavior of the Magi and the implications therein. You think about this in terms of how does this entire narrative begin? They show up and they're having a conversation with King Herod, who is king of the Jews. And what's their question? Where is the one who has been born king of the Jews? Meaning they show up to the most powerful man in the region and they go, "Hey man, I know you're king, but I'm actually coming to look for the real king." And you already know what Herod is like. I mean, it would not have been shocking to the Magi to hear that Herod killed all of the boys in the region in order to try to get rid of Jesus. Everybody knew about Herod. They knew his anger. They knew his temperament. They knew that he had actually murdered his own sons because they were engaging in his mind's eye seditious activity. And so the very fact that they show up and they ask the King of the Jews, where is the real King of the Jews? And then they go and they offer these gifts and give their worship. This was an act of courage. The gifts they gave were courageous. And as we just sit for a few moments and ponder the implications of the gifts the Magi are giving and the courage it took to give them, I think it challenges all of us to think about, what does courage look like in our own story today? Or maybe we can tie this in nicely with the Christmas season, is where is God calling you to be courageous this Christmas season? That oftentimes God calls us to do things and maybe it feels too risky. Maybe it feels like there's too much at stake. Maybe there's a sense of, I don't understand what God is doing, and because we want to have all the details, we don't courageously step in to what God is asking us to do. And maybe there was a hesitation that the Magi had at some point. Maybe they knew going to Jerusalem, asking about the King of the Jews, offering this kind of gift to Jesus could put them in hot water with Herod. But they did what they believed they were supposed to do, irrespective of the consequences. They were courageous in what they did and in the gifts they offered. And it inspires us to be courageous this Christmas season. So however you feel like God has met you in thinking through what He might be asking you to do, may we be people who live very courageously, doing what God is calling us to do, because He knows what He is doing, even if we don't. And our calling is to follow Him in fidelity and in faithfulness. So may we be those kinds of people, not only in this season, but in all seasons of the year.